My name is Una Fitzgerald. I'm the Director of the International Law Research Program at the Center for International Governance Innovation. It's a great pleasure to welcome you here to this very exciting conversation that we're going to have today with three wonderful people from the International Law Research Program at CG. They're going to talk to you about saving the planet, overcoming challenges of emissions monitoring, and climate engineering. So they'll be talking about different ways that we can reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the environment. How do we get to that state where we're no longer destroying the planet through climate change? And they're going to look at how technology could help, but what some of the challenges are related to those different technologies. And they'll also discuss some of the ethical issues as well as legal problems that arise when one tries to use technological solutions to these complex problems. So it's my pleasure to introduce the two speakers and the moderator. So our first speaker, well, they're going to be sitting here having a conversation. The first speaker will be Timiebi Aganaba-Jeanty. And she's a postdoctoral fellow with the law program at CG. And she examines the governance structures addressing global commons environmental issues. Prior to joining CG, Timiebi was executive director of the World Space Week Association. She was a space policy consultant with the Montreal-based consultancy Euroconsult, and a legal and international cooperation officer at the Nigerian Space Research and Development Agency. Timiebi holds a PhD in space law from McGill University. Her doctoral research was focused on the concept of common benefit. And she received the George S. and Anne K. Robinson Space Law Prize for exhibiting advanced research capabilities and original contribution to space jurisprudence. She's also a recipient of the International Astronautical Federation's 2017 Space Leader Award. And you can follow her on Twitter as, I think she's Space Lady or something. Anyway, you'll find her on Twitter. So Timiebi is going to talk about how we measure the greenhouse gas emissions. So there's different ways, you know, that countries have to report on their emissions under the Paris Agreement, but some of that is done in a variety of different ways, and it's not always clear how you compare that data and how accurate it is. But there's a great deal of accuracy that you can gain by using various surveillance techniques, using satellites, for example. And she's going to talk a little bit about that. But she's also going to raise some of the challenges and risks associated with using satellite data in this context. Our second speaker is Neil Craik. He's an associate professor at the University of Waterloo, and he has appointments as well at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development, where he teaches and researches in the field of international and Canadian environmental law. His current research examines the legal structure of global commons regimes. Professor Craik has particular interest in climate and geoengineering law and governance, deep seabed mining regulation, and environmental impact assessment. He's a senior fellow at the Center for International Governance Innovation, and he's the co-director of the BSIA CG International Law Summer Institute, which has been held at CG for the last few years. Neil also serves as the director of the School of Environment, Enterprise and Development at the University of Waterloo. Neil will speak tonight about the subject of climate engineering, a very controversial topic. He'll talk about the potential development of large-scale technologies that seek to counteract the effects of anthropogenic climate change. So instead of us reducing our emissions, we're looking for ways to somehow absorb the emissions that we're already creating or absorb the effects of an overheating planet. But he'll explain that all to you very clearly. How to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and also how to reduce solar radiation, so as another way to cool down the planet. He'll discuss the potential role of climate engineering in a portfolio of responses to climate change. So it's kind of like, you know, if you're told that you've got problems with your lungs, do you stop smoking Or do you start smoking and just add a little extra oxygen, you know? So anyway, he'll explain some of the challenges with this and I guess some of the moral hazard issues related to geoengineering. So finally, I'd like to introduce Freedom Kai Phillips, who will be the moderator for this panel. So Freedom Kai has a Bachelor of Science and a Master's of Arts and a law degree and an LLM, and is currently a research associate with the International Law Research Program at CG. He's also a member of the IUCN World Commission on Environmental Law and a legal research fellow with the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, which is often a partner with CG. Previously, he was the interim director of the Center for Law, Technology and Society at the University of Ottawa, Faculty of Law, and was a legal researcher for the Ramsar Convention Secretariat. So with those words of introduction, I hope you will join me in welcoming our two panelists and our moderator to the stage. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Una. I am not Timiebi, I am Neil Craik. So I'm going to start talking about geoengineering. So first of all, I'd just like to start by thanking CG for the invitation to come and speak to you tonight, and I'd like to thank you for taking the time to come out and talk about this very interesting issue. Let me start with the title of tonight's talk, or at least how I think it applies to my portion of it. And I think it might better read, and I'll try to get the inflection in my voice, saving the planet? Question mark. Can or should we seek to overcome the challenges of climate engineering? And so I want to point out, first of all, that's why the marketing people don't want me on their marketing committees. But also I want to be clear about the agnosticism of my starting point around climate engineering. The technologies that I'm going to talk to you about tonight are largely hypothetical. Their utility, their risks are not yet known, so pursuing the development or implementation of these technologies as a potential solution to climate change is really not usefully answerable at this stage. So if you came here thinking that perhaps I was going to offer a kind of lifebuoy in the sort of sea of sort of climate change despair, you might be a little bit disappointed, but I hope not too much. Does that mean that we should avoid having a conversation about climate engineering? And my answer to that question is no, we should not. And I think that's the reason for that is several-fold. Some elements of what we call under the bundle of climate engineering, and I'll unpack that a bit, are already on the table. And that in itself ought to be a concern, but it's certainly a reason that we have to start understanding and grappling with some of the implications of climate engineering. Climate engineering as a set of technologies presents significant physical and social risks that we need to assess, and we need to understand the governance implications of that. Public acceptance and legitimacy are critical factors to any sound future policy around climate engineering, the degree to which we think we're going to rely on it and implement it. And again, that implies significant policy challenges. And finally, climate engineering, I think, suggests a kind of world, right? A different kind of planet. And it's important to reflect now on the kind of world we want to live in instead of once the technologies are fully developed and become much, much harder to change. So why are we talking about climate engineering? So this is a slide from the latest UNEP emissions gap report. And what the UNEP emissions gap report does is it shows where we currently are in terms of our reductions of greenhouse emissions versus where we need to be. And you can see in the sort of larger chart in the lower corner, you can see our goals are generally between, to seek to limit warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius and to pursue efforts to limit those increases to 1.5. So we often talk about 2 degrees and 1.5. And so you can see the purple and blue lines where we need to be, and then if you move up to the other chart, you can sort of see where we are. And effectively where we are is we're significantly short of where we need to be. So this graph shows what our emissions are projected to be, even taking into account all of the pledges and commitments made under the Paris process. So even if we succeed in doing everything we say we're going to do, we're still not going to meet our targets. And those targets, of course, are set to avoid some very harmful consequences. This is just another way to think about the same thing. This is a slide around carbon budgets. And so a carbon budget is the amount of carbon, the total amount of carbon that we can put in the atmosphere without exceeding either 1.5 or 2 degrees. So the amount of carbon we can put in the atmosphere before we end up with a dangerous amount of carbon and the resulting warming. And so if you just stay on, sorry, I'm not sure which side, your right side, and that's the 2 degrees. And what we see in the blue is the IPCC calculated that we have about 1,000 gigatons of carbon that we can put into the atmosphere. So we've already put in about 1,900 gigatons. So a gigaton is 1 billion tons. And so, these are 2011 numbers. So from 2011, we could put in about 1,000. And then as you see the lower ones, this is what we would have left. And again, if you look at the very bottom one, even if we succeed in all of our potential goals that we've set forward, which are the INDCs, what we would have left in 2030 is 261 gigatons. That's how much we would have left to sort of spend, so to speak. And we currently spend about 40 gigatons a year. And so you can look at that and you can say that's about 8 or 9 years of carbon that we would have left. And again, what that tells us is that we have to think about the sort of full range of solutions in order to address this particular problem. This is just really a quick reminder that states don't always achieve what they set out to achieve. And so this is where Canada's projected to be in relation to its target that it has presented to the international community through the Paris process. And so we've told the international community that we're going to be at 523 megatons of emissions in 2030, but it looks like we're on target for something really significantly higher than that. And so we're talking about climate engineering because it will be a serious challenge to meet the 1.5 or even the 2 degree target. And scientists tell us that the world's going to become a much more unmanageable, expensive, and dangerous, and likely inequitable place if we exceed that target. And so we cannot at this stage narrow the potential policy pathways in ensuring a livable planet. That's why we need to understand the full portfolio of options and assess them in an integrated fashion. So when we talk about climate engineering, what are we talking about? And we typically talk about climate engineering in two sort of constellations or bundles of technologies that do very, very different things. And so this slide shows a set of technologies relating to what is called carbon dioxide removal. So what these technologies do is they would take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and store it or sequester it in some permanent way. And so instead of mitigation, which is reducing emissions before they get in the atmosphere, this is actually taking emissions out of the atmosphere. And we can do this in a number of different ways. So the ways that we're most familiar with now are things like afforestation and reforestation. We can grow biological sinks that will take in carbon dioxide through natural processes. We can do that on land with trees. We can do that on the oceans with algae and phytoplankton. We can also take that biomass, we can burn it for energy, which releases carbon dioxide, but we can capture that carbon dioxide and store it. So we can combine biomass with carbon capture and storage and actually have a net positive impact on energy, so it's clean energy, but because the biomass is taking in carbon dioxide, it actually reduces carbon dioxide. There's chemical processes that can directly capture CO2 from the air. And then there's other chemical processes where we can use minerals, and again, chemical processes that will bond with carbon dioxide molecules, again, to extract them from the air. The status of these particular technologies, many of them are experimental. Some of them are at demonstration level, so we have demonstration plants, but none of them are at scale. Or certainly none of them are at the scale that we would need to make some measurable impact on climate change. And so the key around carbon dioxide removal is not so much the technologies themselves at small scales present serious risks, but when we scale them up, they have some really important implications. The other sort of constellation of technologies is sometimes called solar radiation management or solar climate engineering. And these technologies exploit the albedo effect and basically use different methods to scatter or reflect sunlight away from the Earth's atmosphere. So it operates in a way very similar to large volcanoes, for example, which put sulfate aerosols into the high atmosphere, which then reflect light. And so some of you will remember when Mount Pinatubo erupted, there was actually a measurable cooling of the planet as a result of that eruption. And again, we can do that in a number of different ways. We can directly put sort of aerosols in the stratosphere. Some people have hypothesized about putting mirrors in space. We can manipulate clouds in a way because clouds are white, they have albedo, they reflect sunlight, and they can reflect sunlight out of the atmosphere. Now, of course, what solar geoengineering doesn't do, right? It doesn't attack the problem itself, it attacks the symptoms. The symptoms are global warming, and so what it does is it cools the planet, which may become important, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't address the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and again, that has other implications in terms of acidification of the oceans and things like that. Again, these technologies are not very advanced. I'd say I don't think they're technologies. I'm quite careful. I call them hypothesized technologies. They're ideas that scientists have, but they are doing research and experimentation. The first field experiment on solar putting sulfate aerosols is probably going to take place in Arizona later this year. It's an experiment done by Harvard, which will probably get some press when it occurs. I don't actually think it's very helpful, even though I'm doing it tonight, to talk about climate engineering in this sort of undifferentiated way, because these types of technologies are actually very different. They do very different things. They operate on different processes, different timescales, and have different governance implications. I'm actually mostly going to focus on carbon dioxide removal because I think it's a little more immediate and a little more tractable as a policy problem. So, sorry for this, but this is actually a very important graph. I was going to make some joke about sort of circulating a test later, but some of you may leave, so we won't. But so what this particular graph shows is, so these are total sort of net global emissions expressed in gigatons of carbon. And then all of the different colored lines are what we call integrated models. And so these are sort of projections of what we think the possible pathways are to get to where we need to get to. And the pathways we're interested in are those pathways that are consistent with sort of 430 to 480, that's carbon dioxide parts per million, and so basically the blue lines. And what you'll see about the blue lines is most of them dip below the line of zero. That means at some point in the latter part of the century, what the models, and these are the IPCC models, so these are the models that are being used by the international community to formulate climate policy. So 104 of 116 pathways that get us to 2 degrees go below zero. That means that they have net negative emissions. So what that means is that the assumption is that at some point in the second part of the century, we will be taking out more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than we'll be putting into it. And so what that means is essentially that we're assuming that carbon dioxide removal will be available and will be implemented at scale sometime later this century. One of the implications of this is it means that at some point in the century, we're putting more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere than would get us to 2 degrees. So in other words, we're actually overshooting 2 degrees with the idea that we'll remove carbon and then bring the temperature back down. And again, I think that's a really important thing to understand, this notion of overshoot, because we often think of those temperatures as sort of thresholds, but what the models are showing us is, in fact, we're going to exceed those thresholds and then come back to them through some kind of removal. And that's got really important implications for things like sea level rise. So what happens, can we pull back the sea level? Ocean acidification, ice sheets. And again, we really don't understand the implications, but I think we have to have a serious discussion about what this notion of overshoot might actually mean. This is basically the same diagram. It's simplified a bit. And the only thing I want to point out is that while the net negative emissions projected happen in the latter part of the century, the gross emissions begin quite early on. So on this scenario, we see that we would actually be engaging in carbon dioxide removal as early as 2030. And so again, this is not a sort of far off something that we need to let the next generation worry about, but this is in fact something that's occurring very much here and now. The other thing I want you to notice is the scale. You'll see by the end of the century, what's being predicted is about 20 gigatons of removal. And so remember I said that we actually emit now 40 gigatons. So that gives you a sense of the scale. So this particular model, and again, the numbers vary quite a bit, but what these numbers are saying is that we would intend to remove an amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere that's equal to 50% of what we're putting in the atmosphere today. So again, the scale is really, really significant. And that scale becomes important because when we think about what we have to do, and again, I'll just go over this quickly, but the kind of land use that we would have. And so again, just with BECCS, so that's bioenergy and carbon capture and storage, the land requirements have been estimated, at least by one group of scientists, to be somewhere in the order of 380 to 700 million hectares. And that's a really sizable amount of agricultural land. That's something in the order of 7 to 25% of global agricultural land. And again, if you go through this, there are significant water requirements, significant energy requirements, and so BECCS is energy positive, but direct air capture takes a huge amount of energy to run, and again, so where are we going to get that energy from? And then if you go all the way over to the right, you can see that there's a really massive investment involved in that. the scale of carbon dioxide removal leads to significant risks that are scale related. And those risks relate to sort of ecosystem disruption because of the kind of monoculture. So if we did BECCS, we would have to grow feedstock, so very, very large amounts of some kind of fast-growing carbon dioxide sequestering biomass on very, very large scales. We've seen this with biofuels a bit, that there's, agricultural land competes with biofuel lands. It causes a lot of contestation, food security issues, human rights issues. We have issues around the movement of money around the world. And so there's really a set of really quite serious and quite difficult environmental problems that we'd have to deal with. Again, the impacts of solar geoengineering are very different, but have very, very significant potential risks. Solar geoengineering would work quite quickly, and when you tweak temperature, you can't tweak temperature without affecting precipitation. And so can you do this in a way that doesn't affect global precipitation patterns? And again, and if you do, of course, that's got extremely serious consequences for very large parts of the world which rely on certain kinds of precipitation patterns. And again, solar geoengineering doesn't get at the root of the problem, but does address an important outcome. There's a set of social risks, and the only one I'll really focus in is this thing called moral hazard. So are we, by engaging in climate engineering, are we in fact providing a set of incentives for us not to do what we need to do, which is engage in mitigation? So to use Una's analogy, should we stop smoking, or is this a way to keep smoking? The answer unequivocally is stop smoking. There's nothing about geoengineering, and if you leave here with one thing in your head, geoengineering is not proposed as a plan B, it's not proposed as an alternative to mitigation. No serious scientist or social scientist working around climate change is suggesting that climate engineering would be a substitute for mitigation. In fact, what it tells us, because of the serious consequences of both CDR and solar geoengineering, that we actually have to redouble our efforts around mitigation to avoid having to make some of these very, very difficult choices. That doesn't mean it may not present a kind of moral hazard. There are politicians who have seized on geoengineering as a way of stalling on policy, and I think in some ways, even when we embed CDR in the models like I showed you, what that's suggesting to the international community, perhaps falsely because we don't know if we can do CDR yet, what it's suggesting is that we can reach our 2-degree targets in ways that are sort of consistent with our lifestyle, but that may in fact not be true. So I think one of the really big policy implications is, to what degree should we even be including things like carbon dioxide removal in our models when we don't even know whether they're publicly acceptable, technically feasible, or environmentally acceptable. What are the rules? I just use this slide to answer the question. So some of you may remember an incident off the coast of British Columbia about 4 or 5 years ago, a sort of pseudoscience where people went out and they put iron filings in the ocean with the idea of fertilizing the ocean, growing a big plankton bloom, and capturing carbon. And this caught the world's attention, and the headline from The Guardian is, "Violates UN rules." Violates in quotation, and there are no rules. And I think, again, we need to begin to understand one of the results of this particular incident was the London Protocol, which regulates marine dumping, actually created a set of rules making marine dumping in an unauthorized way illegal. Canada has approved but not ratified that particular treaty amendment. CDR will probably fall under the Paris Agreement and will probably be integrated into into the Paris Agreement and will begin to show up in things like our nationally determined contributions. But the acceptability and the amounts of that is going to be highly contested. Some states are going to want to do this, other states aren't, and there's going to be, I think, quite a serious debate in the next 10 years of the extent to which we allow carbon dioxide removal to show up in these kinds of commitments. And so finally, let me stop there because we'll come back and talk about this in terms of the governance tasks. So I think the number one governance task is really integration, right? So we need accurate, realistic scenarios, and that requires us to take a sort of portfolio approach because we actually have to look at these risk trade-offs. And so we actually have to understand what these risks are, how they might manifest themselves, and figure out which pathways are actually going to make the most sense, recognizing the severe difficulty it's actually going to take to meet our 2-degree target without these kinds of technologies. There's a report coming out in the fall called the 1.5 report, which will look at the feasibility of reaching 1.5, and again, I think carbon dioxide removal will feature very highly in that. Clearly, oversight is a huge issue in terms of environmental and social impacts. And the last point I'll make is really around public engagement, that we can do lots of things that are technically feasible. We might even be able to think about ways of doing them that are environmentally less benign than the impacts of climate change, which is really the trade-off we have to think about, but they still have to have a level of public acceptability. In other words, we have to think about the legitimacy and the engagement, and so we actually do need a public debate around climate engineering in order to move this forward. And I'll just come back to that and leave that with you, and there, if you want to read more. You can. Thanks very much.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Timiebi Aganaba-Jeanty, postdoctoral fellow here. So Neil gave us really interesting insights about a suite of potential hypothetical technologies. So I'm also going to talk about technologies which are used right now to support the creation of information to explain the problem of climate change. But the technologies that I'm going to focus on actually is something that is coming online within the next 10 to 15 years. So it's not operational for greenhouse gas emissions monitoring right now, but it's something that is coming online. So the issue is, how do you start thinking about issues of governance and regulation about that? So interestingly, basically there are essentially 54 or 55 essential climate variables. So that is, what are the issues that we look at to determine how we understand the climate? So looking at sea level rise, sea ice extent, these kind of things. And out of those 54, 26 of them are measurable from space. So right now, to understand the problem of how the climate is changing, we actually use satellite technology, but that's all very behind the scenes. But the real issue that I'm talking about today is not that use of satellite data to tell us about the climate generally, but I'm talking about the use of satellite data for determining greenhouse gas emissions. So essentially, why is this an important consideration? Well, states have to report their emissions. Right, they report their emissions annually to the United Nations, and then everyone comes together, they look at the data, and we now determine what are we going to do for future climate action, what things do we need to do, how are we progressing. But there's actually different ways in which those emissions are determined, and not everyone is using the same metrics for their determination. So currently, you have the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who determine guidance for how you collect this emissions data. And they have a tiered approach because it's understood that not all countries are at the same level with respect to their ability to collect data. So tier 1 methods would be the less advanced methods. Tier 3 would be the more highly advanced methods. Now, the 3 main buckets of ways that we actually determine greenhouse gas emissions are actually, the primary one is calculated, so using statistics. So for instance, we would use activity data, like if we're talking about fuel use. If we're talking about emissions that come from fuel, we would look at how many cars are on the street, how much gas is bought, and then we would have multiplying emission factors that we would now combine and have a calculated number that we come out with to determine greenhouse gas emissions. So that's the dominant method in which we calculate emissions. But as you can imagine, some countries have more advanced statistical systems, activity data and emissions factors, than others. So the level in which we have this different, the level of the inventories in the different countries vary substantially. There's small other ways in which greenhouse gas emissions are detected. For instance, if you want to detect emissions, if you want to detect land usage, how is the different areas of land being used? Satellite imagery is used for that, but that is very distinct from what I'm going to be talking about here. But what are the limitations of inventories? I just stated right now that it does depend on what does your activity data look like, what do your statistics look like. And interestingly, the issue of whether the reporting is actually accurate is underreported. So Zahir did a study, and essentially in this study he found that of the 37 Annex 1 countries in the Kyoto Protocol, so the Kyoto Protocol was the precursor to the Paris Agreement, essentially the countries that submitted their data, out of 37 of them, when their data was reviewed, 92% of them had to adjust and change the data that they'd submitted. And out of that 92%, out of that, 68% led to a reduction in the base year. So essentially, they had to have their data revised after it had been submitted, and they had to reduce their initial base year statistics. Now, Zahir says that the reason for this is understudied, so he doesn't want to say that there's any issues with the actual data collection, but he did ask an interesting question. Is there a built-in bias in the majority of national systems? This data was in 2010, so we can make an assumption that things are better now, but he did raise a good question if there is some kind of bias. So that leads us to thinking, would independent data sources, some international independent data source, something that we have as a record of truth, would something like that play a role to offset this issue of trust in the information? And one such technique is through atmospheric measurements. So what I explained before about the way that emissions are currently determined is that they're calculated. The question is, would the certainty be better if there was a measurement approach? So why satellites in the first place for environmental monitoring? Like I said, 50% of the, 50% of the essential climate variables are measurable from space. And why? Because you have continuous monitoring and long-term operation without having to ask anyone's approval. You get an integrated picture of the global environment. You have repeat cycles, so you can keep going to the same spot at regular intervals. And then you have comparability, and procedures are applied repeatedly. So how would a satellite option for greenhouse gas emissions improve the current scenario? Well, one, we could support verification. We could potentially see who is giving us information that is actually accurate. So of course that would be relevant for things like NGOs who don't trust anyone. It would be interesting for states to see how their counterparts are behaving, and possibly for the UNFCCC, because they have an expert review team who go to look through all the different reports, but actually don't have an independent data source in which they can use for the verification process. Then secondly, the other way this data could improve the situation is to support capacity. So under the Paris Agreement, a new requirement was essentially that developing countries now have to report. And this is not something that they had to do before. So there's a lot of capacity issues. And if you imagine the uncertainty level with our global data sets the way they are now, imagine how they'll be when you have a whole bunch more other countries who have no experience in reporting adding to your global system. Now, this is really important when you think of global processes like the global stocktake, which essentially the first process of that will be in 2023, and that is where we will have collective progress. We will have a measurement of collective progress to see how we're doing. The third one, most interestingly, is to support operations. So now in the business world, there is an increasing emphasis on considering climate risk in your finances and in your business operations. So companies are having to see how can we have more accurate and better information to help us in our operation processes. So for instance, think of oil companies. Think of the oil sands in Alberta. Currently, they say that their data has a 50% uncertainty level. Secondly, they also say that it's extremely expensive to go to the oil sands to collect the data. And thirdly, it's highly dangerous for the staff that have to go there. So what if there was a satellite solution whereby an institution like an oil company, like a Shell, who has operations all over the world, would be able to more cheaply and accurately determine the data, determine their emissions in all their different sites using the same standard technology? So how does all this work? Like, how is it governed? How can you even get access to this data? So international space law actually allows for remote sensing without the permission of the state being monitored, because there's no sovereignty. Sovereignty doesn't apply in outer space. So states can share the information with whoever they want. States can even enter into agreements to limit sharing. So an example here, for instance, is basically the Kyle Bingham Amendment, which provides that US firms who collect data over Israel cannot share that data if it's at a level above other commercial sources available in other countries. So essentially, the US and Israel have an agreement, and we don't get to see high-quality Israeli data. But the remote sensing principles, which was a 1986 UN resolution, calls for sharing data and information at least with the sensed state on non-discriminatory and reasonable basis. So essentially, you can imagine, particularly developing countries at this time, had a lot of concern because they don't have this capability, and they were extremely afraid that their natural resources would all get, taken up by people who could tell what their oil reserves were like, what all their issues were. So essentially, this UN resolution now said that you should share on a non-discriminatory and at reasonable cost basis. But essentially, there are limitations. Now, this sharing applies for improving natural resource management, land use, and protection of the environment. So anything that doesn't fall under there doesn't apply. So for instance, defense or military or national security information, that does not apply and does not need to be shared. Now, from a national perspective, the way this applies is that commercial operators would require a license, and in there, the state who gives the license can put a whole bunch of requirements in there that actually that have foreign policy objectives. So, for instance, there's the shutter control principle, whereby they would say that they can determine that you can't share that data because of some national defense issue, etc. The government usually, who is licensed to satellite, is usually a priority customer. So that would mean that if they decided that they should get first digs at that data, then they can do that because it's one of the licensing requirements. Or they could even request that they want to know who all the people are that you've sold that data to, so they can tell exactly who has bought that data. But interestingly, the emerging use that I'm talking about of GHG for emissions is not something that we'd had before. This Canadian-led research highlights the capability of satellites not designed for this purpose. So in this October 2017 paper, NASA is talking about the Orbiting Carbon Observatory satellite, which was not designed to monitor carbon emissions, but they show that you can actually pretty accurately tell the carbon emissions coming from an individual installations, even though it wasn't designed for that. And why is it important to know this? Essentially, it takes a really long time from deciding what your satellite mission is going to be for it to actually become operational. So the reason we don't have operational systems today is not because it's not a valid method, but because the systems that exist today were designed 10, 15 years ago. And 10, 15 years ago, we cared more about what is the carbon in the atmosphere generally. We didn't care as much in how do we attribute this to individual installations. So there are now new initiatives coming along, and so this is why there are now new initiatives coming along. What I'm highlighting here is essentially the IPCC is now working on its methodological update to its guidance. It's 2019 updates, and what they say here with respect to quality assurance is that they want to update and elaborate verification guidance because the existing guidance is outdated, especially the guidance on comparisons with atmospheric measurements and new data sets. So as it goes down further, it says there's a need to discuss various ways to verify emission estimates in the context of the latest science. So currently at the IPCC level, by 2019, we will see new guidance about how this could actually be applied. Then states are also taking initiatives. So for instance, the Declaration of New Delhi is an agreement that was signed in 2016 by 60 space agencies who came together and said, who came together to talk about addressing the Paris Agreement. And they came together and said, we want to develop an international system, independent system, that will be able to support the Paris Agreement. The second step from that was the Paris Declaration, which happened in December last year, where they came together and they determined that they're going to build this space climate observatory in support of the Paris Agreement. You have the European Commission working on a massive global integrated data set whereby they're going to combine satellite data with in-situ resources with emissions data and then have a data assimilation program which will now determine what the different hotspots are and issue areas and then spit out information, which is in a fully integrated process. But all this is kind of the expected timeline is in the 2030s. But what's really interesting about this is that the private sector say that they're ready now. So in Montreal, we have GHGSet that was established in 2011, and they are the first commercial company who are providing commercial data that can give you attributive greenhouse gas emissions monitoring from individual installations. So for instance, looking at this, what this map is telling you is it's giving you the methane, it's giving you the methane emissions that are coming from an identified coal mine. So what are some of the challenges with this? Essentially, one big question is this sensitive data or is it environmental data? Now, as I told you, the UN remote sensing principles had those 3 criteria in which they determined data that should be shared, and protection of the environment is one of those. But some people would argue that this data is not actually environmental data. This is national security data. Also, GHG chemical signatures can tell you so many things beyond just the initial problem of climate change. So should we be preventing the spread of this data? But then, should this be a global public good? Currently, data is not shared because there's not really a culture of data sharing. It's not part of the producer's mission. The usefulness of some data sets is not that clear. So for instance, some of the Canadian scientists will tell you that commercial option I showed, GHGSet, they don't fully trust it yet because government takes 10, 15 years to build a satellite. But this small company was established in 2011 and they already have customers. Government would be concerned about that. But if we had an international mission, because if we saw this as global data, some questions arise. For instance, a big one is that would need to be determined on a governance level is, how do you determine the pointing equity? Now, what do I mean by pointing equity? Essentially, on the commercial market, the way it works is that, say you only have one satellite, how do you determine who you are looking at? Because if you think about it, if everyone is just looking at the same place, that everyone doesn't like a specific country, so we completely focus on just looking at that country. You have a whole bunch of information about one specific place, and then that data assimilation system that integrates all the data if we think about things like artificial learning, machine learning, artificial intelligence, it builds a profile of specific areas and places. So if there's no process for how do we determine pointing accuracy, how do we determine who we look at, under what conditions, why and how, then that's a serious consideration that would be useful to have a global discussion about. So how would biases determine the kind of outputs and recommendations that the data assimilation tools give? And when the data is integrated from multiple sources, it also brings with it its own biases. So who decides the process of the integration? We don't have an answer to that right now. So then there's also an issue of the coordination of the in-situ components, because actually the modeling community, the satellite community are quite well-integrated processes. But when you now want to add everything together, it now becomes difficult to determine who's going to coordinate that. Next, the issue of verification. So even if we did have this global system and we say, yes, this is really useful because we can determine the greenhouse gas emissions accurately, Article 13.3 of the Paris Agreement may be something that people would bring up. They would say that under the Paris Agreement, the verification procedure that does exist is softened by the fact that the enhanced transparency mechanism must be facilitative, non-intrusive, non-punitive, and respectful of national sovereignty. So one would argue that perhaps it's not compliant with Article 13.3. Now, if we look at other interpretations of this facilitation non-intrusiveness, for instance, under the current processes, then we see that non-intrusive, non-punitive, and respectful means in part that there should be no discussion about the appropriateness of domestic policies and measures, or we should refrain from making judgments on domestic measures. But I would actually argue that you could say that actually the use of satellite remote sensing is actually less intrusive, because no one has to come to your site. And maybe that would be, for some people, that would be less intrusive. The final point, I would say, what are the implications if this is held in the private sector, mostly? So we should on the one hand, we should encourage the private sector, companies like GHGSet, to not just focus on commercial objectives, but also think about these kind of bigger public good concerns, because they are faster, they are cheaper. Like I said, for the other programs, it's going to take till the 2030s. But if we encourage the private sector, could this come online quicker? But then the problem you have there is that the private actors are not subject to any international standards. If we think about air quality, for instance, there's a whole variety of sensors that actually just are garbage. And so would we want the same thing from space? And then finally, the policy to regulate this is dependent solely on the licensing state conditions, and priority access is determined by market factors. So would we really want the private sector, because then it's just one state that is the licensing state that determines everything, as opposed to if we worked on this collectively. So essentially, those are some of the considerations, and we will have the discussion now, I believe.
Where do you want?
Thank you very much, Timiebi and Neil, for very informative and thought-provoking presentations. Now that we've kind of dived into some of these new technologies, we've seen in the past deployment of various technologies to some controversial kind of responses from the public. The first one that kind of comes to mind for me is genetically modified organisms. So where do these technologies kind of fit into the portfolio of options? Neil, do you want to start?
Sure. So I think there's some important similarities between the debates we've had on emerging technologies, such as GMOs, such as nanotechnologies, and technologies around climate engineering. And it really goes, I think, to one of the final points I was making in my earlier discussion around the importance of legitimacy and the importance of public acceptance. A lot of the controversy around those technologies is that they kind of arrived on the scene. They were a fait accompli. before we really had a discussion around their acceptability, their social utility, the kinds of ways in which they could impact social interactions and commercial interactions. And so we've seen a big debate in GMOs around the impact of the privatization of genetic material and seeds and things like that. And so again, I think we have to think about technologies and how we develop technologies in a very sort of careful and reflective way, that we can't necessarily predict what these technologies are going to look like, but we have to continually reflect as they develop, as we do research, and we have to be open about how they're developed. And so I think transparency becomes really a major governance tool in terms of generating the kind of rational discussion that we need, particularly in areas of high controversy.
And Timiebi, you kind of contextualize this as kind of an evolving state of affairs. Where does the portfolio kind of sit currently, and where is it kind of evolving to?
Yeah, so essentially, the evolution is, right now, the technology is focused on, like I said, creating general information about the climate system, which has been useful. But now we really know that people need to be accountable. We need to know that people are actually meeting their objectives, right? So we look at different technologies because we say, how can we support this transparency objectives? And what's really interesting, my recommended read from 2016 is Kalesta Juma's book on innovation and its enemies, basically why people are afraid of new technologies. And that was amazing because he had a whole bunch of case studies. He talked about coffee, margarine, the record industry, GMOs, a whole bunch of different technologies. We don't think of margarine as a technology, but it's a technology because butter was the main issue. And when margarine came, it was just chaos. The same with coffee and alcohol, the same thing. So the idea is just that there's a whole bunch of different issues that drive the fear around new technologies. And just that fear, particularly the incumbents, but just that fear alone stops the conversation happening. And so it's important to have the conversation, even if it's a painful one. But by hearing the different viewpoints, we can actually move forward.
Now, Neil touched on trust as kind of a core issue. Would you be able to kind of expand a little bit upon what some of the level of acceptance is of these technologies, and are there any core concerns around the adoption of them? Timiebi, do you want to start?
Right, so yeah, the issue of trust, I mean, if you don't have the technology or the capability of the technology, you're always going to be concerned about who's developed it, what are their intentions, etc. And something like greenhouse gas emissions monitoring, it can seem that it could be a guise for some other reason that you're monitoring, right? You could say that you're monitoring greenhouse gas emissions, but really you're trying to do something else, right? I mean, for instance, in Canada, under the Canadian Remote Sensing Act, you can't share raw data because there's a concern that you can kind of reverse engineer from the data about the satellite. So there's lots of other nefarious reasons that people would get into satellite technology. But you have to weigh the risks with the benefits, right? And if we were going to take the approach that, if we look at all the benefits that have come from developing this use of satellites, like I told you, 26 of the essential climate variables are measurable from space, then it's something that we have to consider and weigh the balance.
Now, Neil, do you kind of agree with the current state of geoengineering? Is there a lot of acceptance to this, or is there more concern?
Oh, there's not a lot of acceptance at all. I think it's quite the opposite. I think most people, rightfully, when they hear about these technologies, think that they're dangerous, a dangerous distraction to what we need to be doing, which is mitigation and adaptation, and that creates a difficult atmosphere in which to do science around these kinds of technologies. And so I think one of the narratives that was built around climate change that we see is that we can't trust the science, that we see this narrative that's built up by vested interest to sort of say, well, it's too uncertain, or we had that whole climate gate that scientists have some sort of other agenda. And so we end up, instead of talking about what we need to talk about, which are the results, and of course we need to talk about science, we need to talk about its credibility, we need to talk about why we think we can rely on particular types of evidence. But the way in which that science is done has a huge effect on that kind of trust, and so we have to be really careful about vested interests. So there was an earlier field experiment on basically putting a balloon in the air and spraying some water and doing some measurements. So quite environmentally benign, but there became a huge concern because one of the scientists had a patent out on some of the technology, and so there was a concern that vested interest may actually affect some of the outcomes of the science. And so for me, one of the key things that we need to do is we want a debate around climate futures that is informed by publicly accepted science, that we don't want to be debating about whether the science is trustworthy or not. The science has to be done in a way that can inform the debate, because the debate itself is going to be so difficult for a whole number of ethical and other reasons. And so again, I see the trust issue really as being a process in terms of the way we do science, and particularly policy relevant science.
Now you highlighted the kind of dangerous atmosphere that is often kind of looming around some of these emerging technologies. What are some of the implications of these technologies, for instance, on sovereignty, on equity, on national security, and who's really going to be deploying them, from starting with maybe geoengineering?
So again, we have to really separate out carbon dioxide removal from solar climate engineering. I think in some ways, carbon dioxide removal is simpler but not simple. And so there will be distributive consequences in terms of where would this actually occur. So again, these are large-scale activities, and so who has to bear the burden of growing all of this feedstock? How do we actually distribute and allocate? Who actually has to do the carbon dioxide removal? And so there'll be a whole debate that we sort of put aside in Paris around burden sharing by moving to a kind of bottom-up process. You decide what you're going to do. But again, carbon dioxide removal brings that back on the table. Solar geoengineering, I think this is really one of the most difficult things for me to get my head around, is what sort of a governance system would we need in order to employ a technology that would have the impact of affecting global average temperatures for very long time scales. So this is not a 5 or 10 year exercise. This is something that would happen over a period of 100 years. And again, that's the sort of scale of it. And so, if you think of a human endeavor that we've done for 100 years that has this kind of implications, it's hard for me to think of an example of when we've done that and the kind of cooperation that would require, particularly when there will probably be winners and losers in terms of the distribution of the consequences of doing geoengineering. Now, in fairness, some of the people who are doing the modeling are indicating that you can do very sort of shallow solar geoengineering, so it's just basically giving us more time to get better at mitigation and better at adaptation. And if you do less of it, you can moderate some of those influences. But again, that's just modeling. And again, we're back to the trust issue.
Now, Timiebi, you alluded to some national security concerns in your presentation. Can you expand a little bit maybe on that, some of the risks to sovereignty, some of the equity issues as it relates to access to these technologies?
Mm-hmm. Right. Essentially, I mean, when we first started having high-resolution imagery, like I said, you had the concerns of the developing countries who don't have this capability. Mm-hmm. So now we're not talking about resolutions, like what is the centimeters that you're able to see. We're talking about parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. We're talking about, how do we still come up with these age-old problems that someone else with some big top-down technology is trying to tell me about, about what's going on in my territory? And this is essentially the issue you have with some countries. For instance, we had the problem with China where, they had, it was difficult because they wanted to assert that these are what our emissions are and this is what we think we are, and we don't want to hear anything about it. Now, who's to say that you can come and say, well, no, we're going to tell you what the situation is? So for a lot of developing countries, particularly, that's going to be a problem. But this could be very useful also because the burden is also quite substantial of reporting. So for instance, in the Canadian government, the inventories, when we went to see them, they have 30 engineers working on the inventory. Now just think of Botswana. I don't want to pick a country, but how many, there's not going to be 30 people working on the inventories, right? So the issue is just that there are lots of benefits. Even for advanced countries, for instance, that have highly advanced statistical systems, there are some areas where they do have uncertainty problems. For instance, methane in, like, where the cows are. Like, it's really hard to capture this kind of information on a statistical basis, right? So like what GHGSet are doing, measuring methane emissions, that would still be quite useful. So it depends on which way you want to look at it. The national security issues, for some people, it's a big concern. And that's the reason why a lot of data hasn't been shared, satellite data, because of the sensitivity. But essentially, it's weighing the risks and the balancing with the benefits.
Now, what's really the result of if a cross-section of the world just simply says no and doesn't want to participate in either allowing for kind of an external remote sensing or generally is opposed to any type of fertilization or geoengineering?
Yeah, so on one of the risks, again, I think of solar geoengineering, is the economics of solar geoengineering might be very favorable. That it actually, compared to the cost of mitigation, the costs of depositing sulfate aerosols in the stratosphere may actually be may enable a single state to do it. And so unlike climate change, where you actually need all states to cooperate, that's turned on its head a little bit with climate engineering. And so I think one of the things that we probably do need is a clear international rule that would place a moratorium on solar climate engineering, at least until we understand what it is, to ensure that no state is going to do it until there is some global agreement. We can't actually, I can't conceive of a fair and equitable way of implementing that kind of a technology without a high degree of global consensus on its utility, because it affects every state. And so, but then the possibility of having every state agree to that, and this is the same problem that we see, I think, with satellite technology. I mean, my read is that some states will be absolutely reluctant to have any sort of remote sensing of their GHG data, because we know from the climate negotiations that China, for example, has been very strong in terms of its position on verification of emissions. And so I think it's going to be a very difficult international discussion. I will point out to people who are interested that there is a program that's run out of the Carnegie Council by a guy called Yannis Pasteur, who is a former UN Assistant Secretary General in the climate change regime, who's really tasked with going and beginning to talk to international organizations and to states about at least bringing this conversation into international organizations, and including whether there needs to be some international movement towards not a research moratorium, and let me be clear about that, but a deployment moratorium, which no one is talking about doing, just again, to be clear.
Okay. Now, Timiebi, are people, welcoming satellite verification with open arms, or is there some reluctance?
Well, what's really interesting that I highlighted was this agreement between, you had 60 agencies from around the world basically saying that we want to use this to respond to the transparency mechanism of the Paris Agreement. 60 may not sound huge when we're talking about this 200 countries, but that's a lot. That's a lot. That's a lot of countries saying that they want to either develop the technology to do this, or they want to have access, they want to be part of the sharing agreement to get access to this data. So essentially, if you have that kind of mass that are going to be working towards it, it's difficult to stop that going. The question now becomes, how do we ensure that this information, doesn't breach any security issues, or how do we ensure that people do have access, the right people have access, what kinds of controls are there, and things like that.
So you kind of touched on a spectrum of interests. Where does Canada kind of sit in this paradigm? Are they providers of these technologies? Are they early adopters? Are they laggards? You touched on a Montreal-based enterprise. Can you maybe expand a little bit on where the Canadian position is?
Yeah, essentially. So there's no official position, right? But this company in Montreal was sponsored by the Sustainable Technology Development Canada organization, which is funded by the government of Canada. The technology came out of work that was being done at the Canadian Space Agency, and this is the first commercial application of this. So essentially, that would put Canada in a position to be essentially a leader on this area if it goes the way GHGSet want, and they are launching a constellation. They want a constellation of 20 satellites. So if it works the way they propose, then that does add to the conversation, because you now have this global data set from a private company.
Now, Neil, is it similar that we're with the experimentation done off the coast of BC and the quasi, good, bad press from The Guardian? Are we early adopters in this space?
Yeah, so I mean, that experiment off BC was an unauthorized experiment done by someone who wasn't really a scientist, and it was very much an outlier kind of thing, and was seen by many people, including myself, as being an illegal act. But Canada does have a demonstration plant for direct air capture in Squamish, BC. Canada has been, I think, a technological leader in carbon capture and storage. We have good geology for that. And so there may be some research advantages that Canada has around carbon dioxide removal. I think the most interesting thing around Canada's role in this is that you need a country that's got a good reputation in terms of its commitment to tackling climate change to take a lead in looking at climate engineering, whether you're for it or against it. I think right now it would be very difficult for the United States under the Trump administration to be seen as pushing climate engineering, because I think people would question the intentions because of their lack of commitment to climate change. And so Canada, which has a renewed and I think growing international respect for the way it's dealing with climate change, would be seen by many as being able to play that kind of honest broker rule in relation to that. So I recently wrote a policy paper really urging the Canadian government that they really actually do need some sort of national strategy on this issue, because it is occurring, because they are going to international negotiations where this is an issue, and we don't seem to be anywhere in terms of a dedicated research program or any kind of clear integrated policy around climate engineering, on particularly carbon dioxide removal.
No, that's interesting. Where are some of the areas of opportunity in terms of law and governance as it relates to these emerging technologies? And what are really the appropriate forums to be discussing what these international institutions or frameworks should look like? For geoengineering, where would that be?
So I think for CDR, it's really, right now, it's probably national governance as opposed to international governance. I think we just need some robust understanding. So one of the projects I'm working on now is just sort of mapping out where Canada's current laws are in relation to some of these technologies. And so I think the kind of governance framework that we probably need is what I would call an adaptive framework. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, but we need to look at our existing laws and ensure that they can account for some of these technological changes in a sort of reasonable way. And so do we actually have to think about our environmental assessment laws to ensure that they capture these sorts of things? And so it was very unclear when that experiment, the ocean fertilization experiment, whether it was caught or not. It was beyond 200 miles. There was a lot of confusion about whether regulations should or ought to apply. And it's a similar situation with activities in the stratosphere. And so are activities in the stratosphere regulated by the federal government, provincial government? There's a whole range of issues with indigenous groups and carbon dioxide removal because of the land and natural resource implications. I think on the solar side, it's really about research governance. So another project I'm working on is a code of conduct for geoengineering research, which is available and was developed by a colleague of mine, Anna Maria Hubert at the University of Calgary. And part of that project is just talking to scientists and looking at the kinds of things that scientists can do to ensure that the activities they're undertaking are seen as being open, transparent, and effective.
Okay. Now, to me, with these kind of being evolving state of technologies, we have the ability to not only determine what the governance framework looks like now as the technologies are evolving a decade long. Where would that debate be occurring? What's the ideal forum?
I think that's a really interesting question about the forum, because you have basically what the New Delhi Declaration did, the agreement with these space agencies, is that you now have kind of a different area from the UNFCCC process, right? And essentially, the next step that came from the New Delhi Declaration was that this group of countries in Paris last year, they've determined they're establishing a climate space observatory. So in response to that, they are setting that up under the UN Committee on Space. So basically, you have, it's like, do we need to integrate these processes, right? Because if you have like a whole splinter group of space agencies that come together and develop a whole other process here, and then you have the actual states working in the UNFCCC context, I guess you can think about it in terms of like regime complexes, right? Where you say, on the one hand, several different people thinking about a new technology is useful because then we see the best solution. On the second hand, are we diluting international efforts because you're working in the UN Space Committee, you're working in the UNFCCC Committee? So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that unfolds. On the space side, the United Nations is unveiling an Agenda 2030 for space, which they're launching in June, and they're going to announce about this global climate observatory. So it'll be interesting to see what is the actual work that's going to come out of that, how are all these governance issues that I talked about going to be taken into consideration, and then how are they going to feed their processes into the UN system so we have a coherent system that everyone can understand.
Yeah, because I think coherence at the risk of fragmentation in various national approaches would be one of the major challenges. So we have a few minutes to open it up to the floor for a few questions. There are mics at the side of the room, so if anyone in the audience would like to raise a couple questions to our panelists, please take the opportunity now. And we have a few minutes just to be able to field those. So maybe we'll start with the gentleman over there. How are you, sir?
Thanks for a very enlightening talk here. My question is around timing. it seems to me that the timing to get both the geoengineering and the instrumentation is going to take some length of time. And as well, the second part of that question would be, is this going to allow governments to put off doing the mitigation and adaptation that we need to do, saying, well, we'll just wait until we get answers to these kinds of questions?
Yeah, so I think the latter part of your question is really the most important, and I think we have to be really vigilant that that is not the impact. And I think we have to be very clear when we talk about whether it's carbon dioxide removal or other solutions, that there is nothing in any of these technologies which would justify slowing down or not taking the kinds of steps that we need to take on mitigation. Whether governments will use that in an instrumental way remains to be seen, but I think it's very important that that message is made very clearly. Anytime you see a report, and there's been a number of big reports on climate engineering, it's always the first line of the report. Nothing in our analysis of climate engineering suggests to us that we shouldn't be doing everything we can to do mitigation, and that's certainly my impression. In terms of the overall timing, I think that we really do need to start looking at these things, particularly carbon dioxide removal, and understanding the implications, because if it's not feasible, if it's not publicly acceptable, then we really have to change our approach in terms of modeling, because these technologies are embedded in the models that we're using, and they're giving us a sort of false sense of security about our ability to actually meet these targets. And so one of the suggestions that some of my colleagues have made is that perhaps we should be thinking about rules not to include these kinds of technologies that appear to be more hypothetical in our models, to give us a sort of technologically accurate picture of what we can accomplish. But I think part of what we have to do is start getting some clarity, not only on the technological feasibility, but on the ecological feasibility and of course public acceptance, which often gets lost in that. But we can, if the public and governments don't think these are good solutions, then they're not going to be implemented. And again, we need to understand whether that's going to be the case.
I think what you say also raises a good point about, the limits of technology solutions when the issue is a problem of human behaviors. So, that raises a good point that, because you don't want to change your actual behavior, you're now focusing on how are you going to have some objective thing that you can talk about. But, what is interesting about technology solutions is, I guess sometimes it seems easier to have the discussion because you have something tangible that you're talking about, to say, how can we move forward because we have this, as opposed to in a lot of diplomacy debates that you see where you can feel like you're talking a lot and you don't know if things are actually happening. When you have a technology solution, everyone can work towards some kind of goal. But I think you make a great point that, yeah, when it's a human behavioral issue, that should be the primary thing that we should be focusing on rather than the technology.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Sophie. I'm a PhD at the University of Waterloo. So I read this really great article in 2017 by Jason Hickel, who says that 80% of IPCC pathways already assume these negative emissions technologies. And so basically the story goes that as the IPCC was developing these pathways, it became clear that it's the scale of economic activity that is at the root of the problem. And because this came in conflict with the status quo, the IPCC decided to put these technologies within their pathways to sort of avoid that problem. So there is this degrowth imperative that exists. And my reservations with geoengineering is that you're bringing solutions that come from the same logic that got us here in the first place. This idea that we own the planet, that we can manipulate it in whatever way we'd like, So my question is there any sort of discourse in the work you do around degrowth, or is it all sort of technological solutions?
And I'll take a kind of chair's prerogative and add to that and say, what are some of the factors that the public and policymakers really need to be weighing to understand if we want these solutions, and if so, what the government's regime should look like?
Sure. And so that's a great question. Sorry, the lights are really bad in here, so we can't actually see you. So I'm sort of just talking to a sort of being interrogated slightly. And so you're absolutely right about the construction of the models, and so why these technologies ended up in the models. They are economic models, integrated assessment models, and they're trying to get ways in order to get the model to resolve, they have to put certain things into it. And I think you're right that the sort of logic, as you put it, of these models is very much a technologically driven one. There is a significant discourse around this, and I want to be clear, and I think you are clear, that chart that shows that the net negative emissions doesn't mean that carbon dioxide removal is inevitable. What it means is that there's some real difficulties in getting to where we need to get to, but the alternative is that we really have to think of very, very different kinds of patterns of consumption. And so when you look at, there's quite a big sort of ethical and philosophical literature around this, and a lot of it does center on the sort of ethics of hubris. And the way in which the kind of world that we're constructing. And so when I say we need to reflect on the kind of world we want to live in, I think those are the kinds of questions and discussions that we actually need to have, and we really actually need to think about these scenarios. And degrowth is a really significant part of that. There's quite a number of NGOs that are involved in what is quite a small set of discussions, but I think they're certainly raising those kinds of issues at every turn.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry, I'm sneaking up on you.
No, it's fine. It was we could have continued on all night.
Yes, but I think we've covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much for this very, very informative presentation, and it's a real pleasure to have such colleagues as this who are working on such compelling, interesting topics. And thank you, audience, for joining in this discussion and clearly being interested as they were exploring it. As you can see, there's still lots of work to do, so CG will be busy over the coming months, deepening their knowledge on these topics. So before you join me in thanking these panelists with a great round of applause, I just wanted to mention a few events that are coming up. I'll be very quick. There's the museum's Interaction Dialogue is doing a presentation here on Wednesday, April the 11th. On April the 19th, there's a wonderful presentation by IP law expert from Queensland, Matthew Rimmer. So he's coming here and he'll be talking about the new industrial revolution. If your desire to learn more about new technology and law has not been sated by tonight. And on the April the 24th, we have Clive Hamilton, who's going to come and discuss, again, also from Australia. He's going to come on April 24th to talk about Defiant Earth, the fate of humans in the Anthropocene. So you can continue with the theme of doom and climate change. Anyway, so just follow us on CG Online, and you'll find out about lots of events that are coming up. So thank you again. Have a wonderful rest of the evening. I'd like to say thanks to the events team for putting this all together. And please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists and moderator.